You know that feeling, just drowning in information every day. So many articles, headlines, bits of research flying at you, but there's just no time to really get it, to find those insights that actually stick.
Oh, absolutely. Like trying to drink from a fire hose sometimes. Finding the signal in the noise is tough.
Exactly. Well, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we do the heavy lifting for you. We take complex stuff, pull out the key insights, and, well, make sense of it all. I'm your host speaker.
And I'm your expert speaker. Great to be here.
Today we're tackling a really important study. It sits right at this fascinating intersection of, well, being a young teenager, how the brain is changing and how life's challenges kind of shape that.
Yeah, specifically, we're digging into how negative life events, those stressful things that happen, maybe not full-blown trauma, but still tough, how they impact the developing brain. We want to understand what's going on inside when young adolescents face these things, especially with emotions and working memory.
And this isn't just guesswork. We're grounding this whole deep dive in a solid piece of research, a paper from Brain and Cognition. The authors are Gaillard and a team over at Oregon Health and Science University.
And what's really key here, I think, is the data they used. It's from the ABCD study. That's the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's just enormous. Thousands of kids.
Right, which gives us this incredible vantage point, doesn't it? Like a unique look into what's happening across a huge group of young people.
Precisely. That scale gives the findings real weight.
Okay, so first things first, let's define our terms. When this study talks about negative life events, or NLEs, what exactly are we talking about? Because it's not necessarily the same as, like, severe trauma, right?
It's a crucial point, yeah. NLEs here are defined as these sudden changes or difficult situations that kids perceive as stressful or challenging, but they don't automatically meet the clinical definition of trauma.
So, like,
Yeah.
example.
Think about things like parents separating or serious money worries in the family, maybe a parent dealing with mental illness. They're definitely stressful, significant events, but maybe different from, say, experiencing violence directly. They're a common kind of adversity, actually.
And when you say common, I looked at the numbers and it was, well, kind of startling.
It really is. The stats show that over 60% of people experience at least one adverse event before they turn 18, and the knock-on effects, they can be huge. Something like 30% of adult mental illness might be linked back to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. NLEs are part of that picture.
Wow. Okay. So not rare at all. Given that, why focus specifically on adolescence? What makes this period, early teens, so critical for studying these NLEs?
Well, two big things converge in adolescence. First, it's often when we see the first signs of mental health conditions emerging, what the study calls psychopathology. Second, and this is key, it's a time of incredible brain plasticity.
Plasticity,
Yeah.
meaning the brain is really changeable.
Exactly, super adaptable. Like it's being actively shaped and molded by experiences, good and bad, and the potential upside of that is huge. Interventions, support, positive influences during this time could be much more effective than trying to change things later on. It's a window of vulnerability, yes, but also opportunity.
So that plasticity, does it make the adolescent brain more vulnerable to these NLEs, or does it also mean it's better equipped to bounce back? And how does that tie into why mental health issues often pop up then?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, really. And the answer is kind of both. The high plasticity means it can be more easily influenced by negative stuff, potentially nudging development off course. But it also means there's a greater capacity for positive change, for resilience.
Okay.
We often see issues emerge then because the brain's doing this massive reorganization, refining connections, figuring things out. Stressful events can disrupt that delicate process. It's a real balancing act.
And one area that seems particularly affected is emotion regulation. Could you break that down for us? What does that actually mean?
Sure. Emotion regulation is basically how you manage your feelings. It's a whole process, really. How you first notice an emotion, maybe fear, watching a movie, or joy, getting good news, and then how you influence how strong it is, how long it lasts, whether it feels good or bad, and, how you express it.
So like taking a deep breath when you're angry, or pushing through nervousness.
Exactly like that. It can be conscious, like taking that breath, or more automatic. And we know from other research that if your emotion regulation isn't great after negative experiences, you're more at risk for mental health problems later. But strong regulation, that can be a real protective shield. It's a fundamental life skill.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the context. NLEs, adolescence is critical, emotion regulation is key. Now, the how. How did these researchers actually, look inside the brains of these kids? What methods did they use for this deep dive?
This is where the ABCD study is such a powerhouse. Like we said, nearly 12,000 kids tracked over time across the U.S. For this specific analysis, they focused on about 2,150 of those kids during their second follow-up visit.
And these kids were, what, around 11, 12 years old then?
Roughly, yeah. They started the study around 9 or 10, so this data catches them right at the start of early adolescence, prime time for this kind of investigation.
Incredible data set, but how do you measure something like negative life events? It seems kind of subjective. They use something called an impact score, right?
Yes, the impact score. It was a way to try and quantify the NLE load. Basically, they summed up the number of events a kid reported as mostly bad that happened in the last year, and that affected them some or a lot.
Okay, so it captures recency and perceived severity.
Exactly. The score could range from 0 to 25. In this sample, the average was pretty low, about 1.67, but it gives a concrete number to work with for recent adversity.
And then the brain part. They use fMRI, and the kids did this emotional and back task. It sounds complex. Can you paint a picture of what that was like?
Right, so imagine you're lying in the fMRI scanner. You're looking at a screen, and images flash up. You see faces, happy, scared, neutral, and also pictures of places. Your main job is a memory task.
The and back part.
Yeah. In one condition, the 0 back, you just press a button if the image matches a target. Simple. In the 2 back condition, you have to press the button if the image matches the one you saw 2 images ago. Much harder on your working memory.
Okay, so it tests memory, but where does the emotion part come in?
Well, the faces themselves are the emotional stimuli. Happy, fearful, or neutral. The task is designed to measure not just working memory under load, but also implicit emotion regulation. How well does your brain automatically handle the emotional distraction from the faces while you're trying to do the memory task?
I see. So it's measuring how emotions interfere or don't interfere with thinking.
Precisely. It taxes both systems simultaneously.
And which brain areas were they zeroing in on? Did they look everywhere or specific spots?
They focused on 20 pre-selected regions of interest, or ROIs. These are areas already known to be involved in emotion, memory, and cognitive control.
Like the amygdala.
Definitely the amygdala, that emotion hub. Also, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, which is crucial for executive functions like planning and holding things in mind. And other key players, too, parts of the cingulate cortex, hippocampus, striatum, basically the network involved in processing emotions and managing cognition.
Okay, right. So they set the stage, got the data, ran the tasks. Now for the really juicy part. The findings. And you mentioned they were kind of surprising, maybe even flip some expectations. Let's start with emotion processing. What happened in the brain when kids with more NLEs saw those emotional faces?
This is where it gets fascinating, and maybe not what you'd guess. You might expect more NLEs to mean a brain that's like hyperreactive to emotion,
Well,
right? Overwhelmed.
Something like that. More stress equals more alarm bells ringing.
But they found the opposite pattern consistently. More NLEs were linked to less activation in the right amygdala when viewing emotional faces compared to neutral ones.
Less activation. Huh.
And not just the amygdala. They also saw more deactivation in a whole network of other important regions, parts of the anterior cingulate cortex, the caudate, that DLPFC executive control area, the hippocampus involved in memory, a widespread pattern.
Wow. Okay, so across the board in these key emotion and control areas, it wasn't hyperactivation, but rather less activity or even shutting down activity more, a sort of a blunting effect.
That's a perfect way to put it. A blunted response to emotional stimuli, whether the faces were happy or fearful. It suggests changes in emotion regulation, maybe a disengagement from the emotional content, or just altered processing. It definitely challenges the simple idea that stress just ramps everything up.
Okay, that's a major finding on the emotion side. But we know emotion and thinking, especially working memory, are linked. So what happened during the working memory part of the task? Did NLEs blunt that activity too?
Well, this was another surprise, and it actually went against what the researchers initially thought might happen.
Nope.
They found no significant link between the NLE impact score and brain activation in any of those key regions during the working memory contrast. That's the harder 2-back versus the easier 0-back condition.
None at all. So the blunting effect was specific to the emotional aspect of the task, not the cognitive load itself.
It seems that way based on this data. It suggests the impact of these NLEs, at least on brain activation patterns, might be more specific to situations demanding emotion processing rather than those primarily taxing working memory. A very nuanced picture.
That is nuanced. Okay, so the brain activity showed this emotional blunting, but no change related to working memory load. What about how the kids actually did on the task? Did experiencing more NLEs affect their accuracy or speed?
Right, the behavioral performance. This also had an interesting twist. First, looking only at the kids included in the final brain imaging analysis, and remember, these kids generally had good accuracy to begin with.
Right, they excluded those who performed poorly.
Exactly. In that group, NLEs were not significantly linked to overall accuracy or reaction time. They performed well even if they had experienced more NLEs.
Okay, so for the kids who could do the task well, NLEs didn't seem to hurt their performance despite the different brain activity. But that's not the whole story, is it?
No, because the researchers then did another analysis. This time, they included the kids who had NLEs, but were initially left out of the brain imaging part because their accuracy was low.
Looking at the broader, more representative group.
Correct. And in that larger group, having a higher impact score, more NLEs, was significantly associated with lower overall task accuracy.
Ah, okay. So putting it together, for high-performing kids, NLEs might lead to that blunted brain response to emotion, maybe even helping them maintain focus somehow. But for a wider range of kids, including those perhaps struggling more cognitively or motivationally, more NLEs do correlate with generally doing worse on the task. Could that be like a wider disengagement?
That's a very plausible interpretation. It suggests the effects aren't uniform. For some, the brain changes might be subtle, perhaps even adaptive in the short term for performance. For others, the NLEs might contribute to broader difficulties with task engagement or cognitive performance. It really highlights individual differences.
Okay, let's try and connect these dots now. We have this finding of reduced activation, this blunting. How does that fit with existing ideas, like the stress acceleration hypothesis? Does it support it, contradict it?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, actually. The finding of lower activity or more deactivation in those subcortical limbic regions like the amygdala, that is somewhat consistent with one part of the stress acceleration idea.
What part is that?
The part that suggests adversity might speed up certain aspects of brain maturation, leading to lower activity in these emotion processing areas earlier than usual, like the brain is maturing faster, maybe prematurely, in response to stress.
Okay, but you said it was a mixed bag.
Right, because another part of that hypothesis often suggests that this subcortical decrease happens alongside an increase in activity in frontal control regions like the prefrontal cortex. But this study found deactivation there too, linked to NLEs during the emotion task. So it fits one piece but not the other. Makes it more complex.
And the really big question hanging over this blunting finding is it good or bad? Is it adaptive, like the brain cleverly tuning out overwhelming emotions to cope? Or is it maladaptive, a sign of problems down the road?
That is the critical question, and honestly, this study can't definitively answer it. It needs more research, especially longitudinal studies that follow kids over time.
But we can speculate a bit. What would adaptive look like?
Well, if it is adaptive, maybe this neural numbing helps kids maintain focus on tasks like the EN back, or just generally function day to day when facing ongoing stress. A sort of protective emotional detachment, allowing them to keep going.
A short-term coping mechanism.
Potentially, yes.
And the flip side, if it's maladaptive.
Then this blunting could represent a problematic disengagement from emotional information. It might make it harder to understand social cues, empathize with others, or even process their own feelings constructively. Long-term, that could contribute to things like depression, anxiety, or difficulty forming relationships. It might look like coping in the moment but have hidden costs later.
So, more research needed to track the outcomes. What about the other surprising finding, the lack of a link between NLEs and brain activity during the working memory part of the task? Was that totally out of left field in the research world?
It was unexpected for the study's hypothesis, but maybe not entirely unprecedented if you look across all adversity research. Brain responses can be really specific. It's possible the types of NLEs measured here, things happening over the past year, have a different impact than, say, very recent acute stressors.
So timing might matter, or the specific kind of adversity.
Could be. Different types of stress might tax different neural systems. Perhaps chronic past-year stress shapes baseline emotional reactivity more, while very recent stress is what really throws working memory circuits off temporarily. It's complex, and the details likely matter a lot.
And limitations. Every study has them. What are the key things to keep in mind here?
Well, the huge sample size is a major strength. But the EN-backed task is still just a proxy for real-world emotion regulation. It's not measuring it directly. Also, crucially, this was cross-sectional. They looked at NLEs in the past year and brain activity at one point in time.
Right, just a snapshot.
Exactly. It can show associations, but it can't definitively prove that the NLEs caused the brain changes or predict long-term outcomes.
Yeah.
We really need longitudinal studies following the same kids over many years to see how these patterns evolve and whether they predict who develops mental health challenges later in adolescence or adulthood. That's the next big step.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Bringing it all together, this deep dive into the research showed something quite unexpected. Negative life events in early adolescence were linked to a kind of blunted brain response to emotional stimuli.
Yeah, less activation in the amygdala, more deactivation in other key emotion and control areas like the DLPFC.
And interestingly, this effect seems specific to processing emotions. It wasn't seen in brain activity related purely to the working memory demands of the task, at least for the kids who performed well.
But for the broader group, including those who struggled with the task, more NLEs did correlate with lower overall accuracy, suggesting maybe a more general impact on task engagement or performance for some.
It definitely gives us a more complex picture than just stress fries the brain.
For sure. More nuanced, maybe a bit counterintuitive even.
So here's something to chew on. This study found neural deactivation, a blunting to emotion, in young people facing adversity. How does that challenge maybe our default assumptions about stress, just ramping everything up? Could this pattern actually be a kind of neural tuning down as a way to cope? And if it is, what does that mean long-term for emotional health and well-being? Thinking about that incredible brain plasticity during these years,
Oh, wait.
what questions does this raise for you about how we can best support kids through tough times?
Lots to think about there.
We'll leave you with that.